Oh, thank you so much, Chair Sosa, co-chairs Chaichi and Osborne, members of the committee. I want to thank you for taking up this important legislation, and I want to extend my deep gratitude to Representative Owens for hearing my constituent concerns and introducing this bill to combat elder financial scams. Based on your introduction, I do want to note that I'm here in my personal capacity and not testifying on behalf of the Oregon Judicial Department. Oregon does not have effective law enforcement tools to investigate, apprehend, and prosecute criminals who prey on the elderly. My mother and mother-in-law were both victims of these crimes. Back as a background, my mother-in-law worked in the banking industry for most of her career, and my mother was a probate legal secretary for 40 years. They are smart people. My mother-in-law uses Amazon to make purchase, as many in Eastern Oregon do, to avoid long hours driving to shop. She received an unsolicited phone call from a man stating that he was an employee of Amazon and he'd accidentally credited her Amazon account $80,000, and he was on the verge of losing his job if he did not get the money back, and he began to cry. My father-in-law had died less than a year before, and she was still reeling from the loss. She asked the man for some documentation, and he sent her a falsified document purporting to be a ledger. He had her email address. He told her that his family and his children were on the verge of starvation, and the situation would lead to homelessness and worse. She became incredibly emotionally involved with this man, who called 4 or 5 times to work out the details. Eventually, he convinced her that she had wrongly received $80,000, and her, having a compassionate and kind heart, did not want to any harm to come to this man or his family, went to her bank and transferred $80,000 to another bank account in New York City. The bank clerk tried to persuade her not to send the money, but she was convinced it was the right thing to do. Afterwards, my wife, her siblings, and I were alerted to the transfer. Local law enforcement was contacted by my sister-in-law, but they didn't have the tools to even begin to address the fraud. The FBI was contacted, but they have financial threshold requirements that are involved, and $80,000 doesn't trigger federal law enforcement involvement. After our local law enforcement struck out, I asked the officer for bank information. I reached out to the New York bank. They could identify the deposit, but the money, according to the banker, was immediately placed into cryptocurrency and disappeared untraceable to them. I contacted the Oregon Department of Justice and spoke to a special agent there who told me they didn't have the technological capacity to track the money. The technology may exist, but there was no way for them to help. Mom is $80,000 poor, and no one could help her recover what she lost. She has never recovered the same level of personal confidence she had prior to this theft. My mother was nearly as unlucky. My son was traveling to John Day to Portland for a Future Business Leaders of America state tournament. I think they call that a humble brag. My mom lives in Clackamas, and I knew he was going to be in town. I'm not on social media, but members of my son's team and coaches were. My mother received a call that was purportedly from the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office stating that my son had been driving in town and had rear-ended another person and been arrested for injuring that person. The alleged officer went on to state that my son was being held on $9,000 bond, and unless he was paid, he would be held indefinitely. They then put on a male crying, begging grandma to bail him out. My mother, being 83 at the time and hard of hearing, was devastated. My mother called me, but I was in transition from one courthouse to another and had no cell service for about an hour and a half. She was so upset, she went down to the bank. When I called her back, she was one person away from withdrawing $9,000. It took me a full minute to convince her to step out of line so we could figure this out, since she was so concerned about my son's safety. She made me promise that I'd get him on the phone with her, which I did, and you can only imagine how vulnerable this made my mother feel. She lost a lot of trust in herself that day. I spoke with a deputy from Clackamas County who investigates cybercrime to report this crime while the criminals were waiting to hear back from my mom. He told me about harvesting data on the internet and how criminals find a mark, create a story based on information readily available to them, and spring these terrible traps on our most vulnerable citizens. I gave him all the numbers that we had and the information we had, and he told me the phone number is attached to an IP address. We don't have the resources to track down this offender. In conclusion, the answers from law enforcement are unacceptable to me, and I know they're unacceptable to you. House Bill 2330 creates a work group to evaluate what tools exist, what tools need to exist, and what techniques Oregon law enforcement need to capture these criminals. Further, the work group will consider various ways Oregon can inform citizens of these scams and get the word out on the ways to prevent these types of crimes from happening to them and their loved ones. And I thank you for allowing me to tell my family's story, and I ask for your help to track down these offenders and punish them for preying on our honored elderly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your testimony. Representative Owens, please.
Good afternoon. For the record, Mark Owens, House District 60, Chair Sosa, Vice Chair Chaichi, Vice Chair Osborne, members of the committee. Thank you for giving us time to come and pitch House Bill 2330 to you. We can go through a lot of facts, we can go through a lot of stories, but I imagine every one of you have heard these stories. If they're not a loved one of yours or acquaintance of yours, you've heard them in your community. And what we're doing when we call law enforcement and they say it's even tough, the financial exploitation investigator from OHDS said it's hard enough for law enforcement FBI to even trace these cases. It's not very satisfying when we share that with our community or we share that with our families. The National Council of Aging says billions of dollars are being lost by our elderly every year. And we can't tell them that we can't do anything about it, or we tell them we can't do anything about it. That's not satisfying. Too many times as colleagues, we look at bills that come through our desks, come to our committees, and we say, hey, this is a solution looking for a problem. Well, this one's not. This one's a problem looking for a solution. And the solution is get some smart people in the room and figure out what we can do. The criminals that are preying on our elderly are taking advantage of us and taking advantage of our system. They're using cryptocurrency, they're using technology, they're using IP addresses for phone lines that the police say they can't do anything. Give them the tool to come together and give us some recommendations. Judge Raschio tried to figure out what the solution was this. We don't have it. But there are smart enough people in this state that can do this for us. All we're asking for is a task force. We'll fight in ways and means to get the funding. And there's other people smarter than me who are going to testify after this. Thank you for giving me some time.
Thank you very much, Representative Owens. Any questions?
I do have a question.
Yes.
This is probably for the judge. Thank you, Chair. What you had mentioned a threshold for the federal government to go after this. What is the threshold?
To be honest with you, Vice Chair Osborne, thank you for your question. I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you that $80,000 doesn't get them out of bed.
Yeah, follow up.
Yes.
So, and this would be for Representative Owens. So if $80,000 doesn't get the feds out of bed, how many dollars is it going to take to get the state out of bed?
Chair Sosa, Vice Chair Osborne, great question. And I think that's one, once again, I hope that's what the task force will identify, where the thresholds in order to have more resources put into this. Because of course there is always going to be the conversation on what is the return of investment for the time that we have to do to investigate something. But it's not all, as Judge Raschio said, about the money. It's about our elderly losing faith in who they are, losing faith in the judgment values they can make, and actually setting themselves not for a good sunset, lack of a better term. It's more than money.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Representative. Really appreciate it.